There is an image that almost every Christian immediately recognizes: a world leader, a charismatic figure, a character who will appear at the end of the story to deceive crowds. This character's name is familiar: the Antichrist. In the popular imagination, he appears almost as the great villain of the final stretch of the story. Biblical: a specific individual, a specific moment, a specific event. But there is a curious detail. When the word Antichrist first appears in the New Testament, it does not appear like this, not even as a single character, not even as a distant event, not even as a revelation at the end of the world. It appears in a letter, a short letter, targeted at specific communities, talking about a problem that was already happening at that time. And the detail that almost always goes unnoticed is simple. The text does not speak of an Antichrist. The text speaks of Antichrists. In the plural, and not just that. The author of the letter writes as someone who is looking at something that is already happening before your eyes. Not something reserved for the future, but something that was already present within the Christian environment of that period. It may seem like a small detail, a simple grammatical choice, but it is exactly at this point that the story starts to get more interesting. Because over the centuries, the popular image of the Antichrist has become one of the most recognizable elements of Christian eschatology. Meanwhile, that little plural became more and more silent, almost invisible. Then an inevitable question arises. If the text talks about Antichrist, why did popular tradition almost always end up talking about the Antichrist? At what point did this plural stop being the center of the conversation, and as a word used to interpret conflicts within first century communities, ended up becoming one of the most dramatic characters in the Christian imagination about the end times? To understand this, we need to go back to where it all begins, not in modern theories, but in the text itself, where this word appears for the first time. Before any theory, before any eschatological system, even before historical interpretations that emerged later, there is a point that needs to be established calmly. Where exactly does the word Antichrist appear in the New Testament? Interestingly, it doesn't appear in many places. In fact, it appears only in letters associated with the Johannine circle, mainly in the first epistle of John and also in the second epistle of John. And when we look at these texts carefully, one thing stands out immediately. The word always appears within a context of community discernment, not as a description of a world ruler, not as a future political figure, not even as a scene at the end of the story. It appears within a pastoral conversation. The author is speaking to Christian communities who are dealing with internal tensions, people teaching different things, confessions about Jesus being disputed, groups if separated. And in this scenario, he writes something quite direct. Little children, this is the last hour, and just as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, so many Antichrists have arisen. The plural appears without any ceremony, no long explanation, no dramatic build-up. He simply assumes that his readers understand what he is about, speaking. But the text does not stop there. Elsewhere, the author explains how to recognize this phenomenon. He speaks of a spirit of Antichrist that manifests itself in certain types of denial about Jesus. And once again, the language is surprisingly immediate. It is not something reserved for the distant future. The author states that this spirit is already in the world. This detail changes the framing of the word. Because here, Antichrist does not appear as a awaited character on the horizon of history. The word functions almost like a diagnostic category, a way of interpreting something that's already happening among those communities. This raises an interesting question. If the term was born in this context, describing a present, multiple, and linked phenomenon to conflicts within churches, how he ended up being associated centuries later with a single eschatological character. It may seem like just a change of emphasis, but when we look at the history of Christian interpretation, we realize that this change has altered much more than it seems at first glance. And to understand why, we need to look at the type of crisis those communities were facing at the end of the first century. When we read these letters today, it is easy to imagine that we are facing a theological text abstract, as if the author were writing an organized treatise on doctrine. But the tone of the letters shows something else. They look more like messages written in the middle of a crisis, and not an external crisis. There is no mention of Roman persecution at that specific time in the letter. There is no focus on political threats. There is no discussion of empires or rulers. The problem appears to be within the network of Christian communities itself. Several clues scattered throughout the text point to this. The author talks repeatedly about abiding in what has been heard from the beginning. It talks about confessing Jesus correctly. Talk about loving your brothers. And at the same time, it insists on a language that separates people into two groups very clear: who remains and who left. There is a moment in the letter where he summarizes what happened in an almost abrupt, "They came from us, but they were not from us." This sentence seems simple, but it reveals a very specific type of rupture. We are not facing an attack from outside. We are facing an internal rupture. People who were part of the same environment, the same teaching, the same coexistence, and who was now following another path. It may seem like a small detail, but this type of situation usually has a negative effect. Predictable in any community. When people come out with different ideas, the inevitable question arises: who continues to represent what is true within the group? And it is exactly at this kind of moment that words begin to gain weight. Expressions that were previously just descriptions now function as markers of order. Who's inside? Who is out? Who remains? Who breaks? In this scenario, the vocabulary of 1 John begins to make more sense. Spirit of truth, spirit of error. Who confesses? Whoever denies it. And among these categories, that strong word also appears: Antichrists, not as an announcement of a cosmic event, but as a way of interpreting something very concrete that was happening there. A community trying to understand and explain why people who once did, when we read the word Antichrist, we tend to immediately imagine a heavy theological category, something linked to great systems of doctrine, debate, theories of the end of history. But within the Johannine letter, the word seems to function in a more immediate way, almost like a community organizing tool. This becomes clearer when we look at the vocabulary that appears repeatedly in First Epistle of John. The author uses several expressions that function as markers of belonging. Remain. Listen from the beginning. Confess that Jesus came in the flesh. Love your brother. These phrases do not appear by chance. They help define what it means to be part of that group. And when a community begins to define its borders, it also needs to define the contrary. Who is not inside? Who broke up? Who started teaching something that the group understands as incompatible with what they received at the beginning? It is at this moment that certain words begin to have a very specific function. Don't just explain an idea, classify a rupture. And this is exactly where the term Antichrists comes in. It appears as a way of naming those who, in the letter author's perception, they began to deny central elements of what the community affirmed about Jesus. The interesting thing is that the term appears in the plural. This does not suggest an isolated character. It suggests a type of phenomenon, different people, different situations, but a pattern that the author believes he recognizes. It may seem like just a language detail, but this choice greatly changes the way the word works, because in this context, Antichrist doesn't seem to be pointing to a great antagonist of the story. The word functions more as a category of discernment. One way to say, when this type of denial appears, we are faced with something that opposes what we confess. The expression sounds eschatological, but in practice, it is being used to deal with a very serious community problem. Present, and this detail sets the stage for something even more interesting. Because at another point in the letter, the author doesn't just talk about people. He also speaks of a spirit associated with this type of opposition. At a certain point in the Johannine letters, the discussion goes a step further. The author doesn't just talk about people who are teaching different things. He introduces an expression that expands the way of seeing the problem. He talks about the spirit of the Antichrist. This expression appears in the first epistle of John, when the author guides readers to test the spirits. In other words, do not automatically accept any teaching that circulates within the community. The logic is simple. Not all religious discourse represents the same type of influence. Some reflect the spirit of truth. Others reveal something different. And it is in this contrast that the expression appears. Spirit of Antichrist. The important detail is that at this point in the letter, the word stops working just as a label for certain people. She goes on to describe a pattern of opposition, a type of posture, one way of interpreting who Jesus is and what his presence in the world means. According to the author, this pattern appears when someone denies or redefines what the community considers it central to the confession of Christ. And then comes a sentence that changes the scenario quite a bit. He says the Spirit is already in the world. It is not something reserved for the future. It is not something that will only emerge at the end of the story. From the perspective of the letter, this type of opposition was already present in the environment in which those communities live. This turns the word Antichrist into something a little different than many people think. Imagine, instead of pointing to an isolated character, the text suggests a recurring dynamic, a type of denial that can appear at different times, in different places, in different people. It may seem like a small distinction, but it changes the role of the word within the letter. Because in this framework, the focus is not on identifying a major future enemy. The focus is on discerning patterns that are already circulating within the community itself. And this explains why the author uses the plural so naturally. If we are talking about a phenomenon that repeat itself, it makes sense to talk about Antichrists. More than one manifestation, more than one situation in which what the community understands as the central confession about Christ begins to be denied or reinterpreted. This way of thinking transforms the word into something much less cinematic and much more practical. But precisely for this reason, a delicate question arises. If Antichrist began functioning as a way of discerning conflicts within Christian community itself, what exactly was happening in those communities? Why did this language become necessary? To answer this, we need to look at one of the most direct sentences in the entire letter. There is a phrase in the Johannine letters that, when read calmly, reveals much of what was happening at that moment. It appears in the first epistle of John and is written almost as a commentary on something readers already knew. The author says, "They came from us, but they were not from us." The sentence is short, but it has a whole story behind it, because here we are not talking about unknown people. They were not external opponents. They were not distant critics. These people were part of the same community. They shared the same environment. They heard the same teachings. They participated in the same community life. And at some point, something changed. Some began to teach different things about Jesus. Others began to interpret certain points in a way that the author of the letter considered incompatible with what had been transmitted from the beginning. The result was a rupture, and ruptures of this kind are never just intellectual. They are also emotional and social. Friendships break, leadership is divided, groups begin to reorganize. In this scenario, the community needs to find a way to interpret what has just been said. Why are people who are here no longer here? Why does someone who used to teach alongside us now teach something different? It is in this type of moment that strong expressions emerge, words that help explain what seems inexplicable. And within that letter, one of those words is precisely Antichrists. The plural makes sense in this context. We are not facing a single central opponent. We are facing several ruptures happening within the same environment, several voices emerging, several different interpretations circulating, and the author of the letter is trying to give a name to this phenomenon, something that, for him, is not just a difference of opinion, but a direct opposition to what the community believes it has received from the beginning. That's why he doesn't treat the episode as a simple disagreement. He interprets the rupture as a telltale sign, a way to understand who really remained within what the group understood as his central confession. And this is exactly where the word Antichrist takes on its function, not as a prediction, but as an interpretation of a recent event, something that had just happened within the Christian community itself. And curiously, even at this early moment in Christian history, this would not be the only way to understand this word. So far, when we follow the text of the Johannine letters, the scenario seems relatively of course. The word Antichrists appears within a specific context: internal conflicts, ruptures within communities, different teachings about Jesus, and an attempt to interpret all of this in light of what the group believed they had received from the beginning. In this environment, the plural makes perfect sense. He describes a phenomenon that was already happening. But when Christianity begins to spread to other regions and other generations start reading these texts, something interesting starts to happen. other biblical traditions enter the conversation. For example, texts like the book of Daniel and second epistle to the Thessalonians already, they talked about opposition figures associated with the outcome of the story. In Daniel, images appear of arrogant rulers who challenge God's people. In 2 Thessalonians, the figure of the man of lawlessness appears, described as someone who rises up against God. These traditions do not use the word Antichrist, but they do have something that catches your attention, the idea of a great opponent at the final moment of history. Now imagine what happens when Christian readers in subsequent centuries begin to read all these texts together. On the one hand,
These are the cases of the two writings
talking about
Antichrist.
On the other, apocalyptic traditions describing an eschatological enemy. The temptation to bring these images closer is almost inevitable. Little by little, a different reading begins to emerge. Instead of treating antichrists as a recurring phenomenon within communities, some interpreters start to see the word as a clue about a great future antagonist. In this new framework, the plural continues to exist in the text, but it begins to be understood in a different way, as if it was some kind of preview, small signs anticipating something bigger. It may seem like just a subtle change, but it greatly changes the role of the word within the Christian imagination, because a recurring phenomenon within communities is one thing. The expectation of a great adversary that will emerge at the end of the story is another, completely different. And little by little, this second way of imagining the problem begins to gain more and more importance, more space. Not because the plural disappeared from the text, but because another way of telling this story began to seem more convincing and perhaps more dramatic. There is a point where two different ideas end up intersecting, and over time they start to look like the same thing. This happens when the theme is Antichrist, because historically, two distinct categories were placed side by side, and when that happens, the meaning of the word begins to shift. The first category is very old within the life of Christian communities. It appears when groups begin to face internal teaching differences, different interpretations, different readings about who Jesus is, and in some cases, ruptures that lead people to leave the community. This type of situation has always existed in the history of Christianity, and texts like the first epistle of John seem to deal with exactly this kind of scenario. In this environment, strong words appear to try to interpret what is happening. Error, deception, false teaching, and also that specific word, antichrists. Here the logic is communal. The focus is on discerning a conflict that is already happening. Now, compare this with another category that also appears in certain biblical traditions. Texts such as the book of Daniel and the Apocalypse of John use symbolic images to describe moments of decisive confrontation in history. Beasts, kingdoms, rulers who rise up against God. This type of language builds a climactic narrative, a time when evil seems to concentrate on specific figures before being, do you notice the difference? In the first category, the problem is internal and recurring. In the second, the conflict appears as a major final scene in the story. The two ideas coexist within the biblical tradition, but they are not exactly the same thing. The curious thing is that, over time, the word Antichrist began to migrate from a field for the other. an expression that, in the Johannine text, seemed to serve to interpret ruptures within the communities that began to be embedded within the narrative of a great antagonist, eschatological. When this change happens, the Word begins to produce another type of expectation. No more discernment of present conflicts, but the anticipation of a specific character who will emerge at the end of the story. And when a word changes category, it also changes the type of imagination it activates in people. This displacement paves the way for the most decisive moment in this history, because at some point in the Christian tradition, this new way of understanding the Word left to be just a possibility. It has become the dominant interpretation. So far, we have followed the word Antichrists within the environment in which it appears for the first time. In the Johannine letters, the term works almost as a lens to interpret ruptures within the Christian community itself. Something that was already happening. Something multiple. Something that could appear in different people and moments. But when we move forward a few centuries in the history of Christian interpretation, something begins to change. And this change doesn't happen all at once. It emerges little by little as readers and Christian leaders begin to try to organize different biblical texts within the same narrative about the end of history. This process begins to become more visible among thinkers of the ancient church, such as Irenaeus of Lyon and, shortly afterwards, Hippolytus of Rome. These authors were deeply interested in understanding how various biblical passages were connected, especially texts linked to the outcome of the story. For example, the symbolic visions of the book of Daniel, the figure of the opponent described in Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, the images of the final conflict present in the Apocalypse of John. These texts do not use exactly the same vocabulary, but all describe some kind of intense opposition before the final restoration. Then comes an attempt to stitch these pieces together into a single coherent story. And it is exactly at this point that the word Antichrist begins to change position within of Christian interpretation. Before that, in the Johannine letters, the term seemed to function as a category for interpret conflicts present within the community. After this phase of theological synthesis, he begins to be associated with a great eschatological adversary. The logic behind this change is relatively understandable. If several texts speak of opposition to God, if some describe a decisive conflict at the end of the story, and if the Johannine letters speak of Antichrist, why not imagine that all these elements point to the same figure central? This type of reading had an important advantage. It created a more unified narrative. Instead of various types of opposition spread throughout history, the idea of a great final antagonist, a figure capable of symbolically concentrating the entire conflict between the kingdom of God and the forces that oppose him. This movement did not erase the plural of letters. The text remained there, but the plural began to be reinterpreted. In many cases, it came to be understood as minor manifestations that anticipate the arrival of the true Antichrist, small signs before the big final confrontation. It may seem like just an interpretative adjustment, but it completely changes the way the word works within the imagination of Christians. Because from that point on, Antichrist stops being just a category used to interpret conflicts within communities. It comes to occupy a dramatic role within the architecture of the end times. And there is a curious detail in this turn of events. If the original reading of the letters had remained dominant, perhaps the word Antichrist, remembered today more as a tool for community discernment than as the name of a specific eschatological character. But the history of interpretation took a different path. And when an interpretation manages to unite several different texts within a narrative unique, it usually gains strength quickly. From that point on, the plural would continue to exist in the text. But the Christian imagination was already beginning to see something else. After that turning point in interpretation, the idea begins to spread. What was previously just a possible reading begins to gain stability within the Christian tradition. And this happens especially when theologians and church leaders begin to organize the Christian teaching in a more systematic way. Between the 2nd and 4th centuries, authors such as Irenaeus of Lyon and Hippolytus of Rome were already exploring the idea of a great final opponent who would emerge before the definitive restoration of history. They looked at several texts at the same time. The symbolic visions of the book of Daniel, the figure described in the 2nd epistle to the Thessalonians, often called man of lawlessness, and also the dramatic images present in the Apocalypse of John. Each of these texts had its own context and its own language, but when read together, they seemed to form a bigger picture. And within this framework, the word Antichrist ended up becoming a kind of point of convergence. Instead of several different forms of opposition spread throughout history, it begins to the image of a central figure that would represent the culmination of this conflict emerge. This way of interpreting clear identity. It helped organize several biblical texts within the same narrative. Eschatological. When an interpretation succeeds in doing this, connecting different passages into one coherent story, it tends to become very influential. And that's exactly what happened. As time passed, the figure of Antichrist began to appear in biblical commentaries, catechesis, and explanations about the end of times. The plural of Johannine letters does not disappear completely, but it starts to be treated as something secondary, something that prepares the ground, as if the Antichrists mentioned in the letters were just minor signs that anticipate the emergence of the great final antagonist. This process continued to advance throughout the Middle Ages. The figure of the Antichrist becomes part of the Christian imagination in an increasingly concrete. Sermons, theological writings, and even artistic representations begin to explore this idea. And little by little, something curious happens. The word "that," and in the original text, it appeared amid conflicts within communities in the 1st century, begins to occupy a central place in Christian narratives about the outcome of history human. The plural is still there in the text, but in practice, the singular had already conquered the imagination. When we reach the modern era, something curious happens with the word Antichrist. The biblical text remains exactly the same. The letters keep saying Antichrist in the plural. But in most people's ears, another image almost always appears: the Antichrist. Unique, a specific figure, almost always associated with dramatic events at the end of history. This shift did not happen because the text changed. It happened because the way of telling this story changed. Over the centuries, the interpretation that concentrated evil in a great antagonist. It organizes several biblical texts within the same sequence, creates expectation, builds tension, and above all, it offers a story that is easy to convey. As Christianity entered the modern period, especially with the growth of printed culture, this type of narrative begins to circulate with even more force. Prophetic comments, eschatological pamphlets, popular studies trying to identify signs of the last generation. In many of these materials, the word Antichrist almost always appears in the singular, not because the plural has disappeared from the text, but because it no longer occupies the center of interpretation. The plural is now treated as a side note. Something like, yes, there are many antichrists throughout history, but the true Antichrist will still come. This formula appears repeatedly in modern explanations of eschatology, and it creates an interesting effect. The text of the first epistle of John continues to be cited, but it starts to function almost as an introduction to another expectation, the expectation of a future character. Over time, this framing spreads beyond theological books. He appears in sermons, in popular biblical studies, in religious programs, and even in cultural productions inspired by eschatological themes. The figure of the Antichrist becomes a recognizable character, something that the public can quickly imagine. Meanwhile, the original detail of the text, that simple plural used by the letter's author, begins to disappear from collective memory, not because it was denied, but because it was swallowed up by a larger narrative. And here comes an interesting observation. It was not the text that changed. It was the way in which the following generations decided to organize the pieces of the biblical story. When this type of reorganization happens, certain words start to carry expectations that were perhaps not so explicit in their original context. And this explains why, today, many people can hear the word Antichrist without realizing that in the text where she was born, she almost always appears in the plural. When a word changes position within the history of interpretation, it also changes the type of imagination it awakens in people. And with Antichrist, exactly that happened. If we look at the original use of the word in the Johannine letters, especially in First Epistle of John, the focus seems to be very close to the life of the community. The concern is to recognize what is happening within the environment itself, Christian. Different teachings, internal ruptures, confessions about Jesus being reinterpreted. In this scenario, talking about Antichrist works almost as an invitation to discernment, not in the sense of looking for a distant enemy, but in order to pay attention to the dynamics that arise within the community. Now compare this to the reading that has become more common in popular eschatology. The expectation of a singular Antichrist who will emerge at some dramatic moment in history. This way of imagining the problem produces a different type of attention. Instead of looking at the tensions within the community, the gaze often turns to large outdoor scenes, political movements, world leaders, global changes that seem to point to the climax of the story. Do you notice the difference? A reading tends to produce community vigilance. The other tends to produce historical surveillance. In the first, the danger appears as something that can arise within the faith environment itself. In the second, the danger appears as a figure concentrated at some point in the future. This does not mean that one of these ways of imagining history needs to cancel out the other. The interesting thing is to see how each reading organizes the reader's attention in a different way. Different way. A word that began describing ruptures within first-century communities, it ended up being integrated into a much broader narrative about the end of history. And depending on which of these readings occupies the center of the Christian imagination, the practical effect also changes. Because what a community learned to observe usually reveals the kind of story she believes she is living. After all this journey, the word Antichrist seems different, not because the text changed, but because now we can see the path this word has taken. It is born within pastoral letters, written to real communities, dealing with real conflicts. In the text of the first epistle of John, the word appears almost in a practical way, an attempt to interpret ruptures, to explain why some people were teaching something different about Jesus. In this scenario, the author speaks of antichrists, in the plural, not as a dramatic prediction of the future, but as a way of recognizing a type of opposition that was already happening there. Over time, however, other biblical traditions began to enter the same conversation. The symbolic visions of the book of Daniel, the images of the final conflict described in the Revelation of John, and the theological interpretations that tried to organize all of this into a single narrative. It was in this process that the word began to travel. It came from a letter, entered a system, and along the way, he changed his role. The plural continued in the text, but the Christian imagination began to remember the singular more easily, not because someone deleted what was written, but because another way of telling the story ended up becoming more influential. And maybe that's exactly what makes this word so interesting. It shows how an idea can be born in a specific context, cross centuries of interpretation, and end up occupying a very different place within the collective imagination. In the end, understanding this story doesn't change the text, but it changes the way we perceive how certain ideas came to be the way they are. Today,